Welcome once again to After the Buzzer, and this week in our continuing journey down memory lane, Mike Gross and I will discuss the 1986 Fiesta Bowl, which was for the national championship between Penn State, which was number 2, and Miami, which was number 1. Mike is on the line with us. Mike.
How's it going, my man?
Outstanding. And yourself?
I'm great. Good. Thanks.
So I just wanted to give a short rundown before we get into the nitty gritty of this game. And that game, as we know, Penn State beat Miami 14-10 to win their second national championship. Their other had come in 1982. And there was a lot of fanfare around this one because it was played on January 2nd, 1987, after all the other bowls. And it was kind of a unique situation. I think it was the first time that happened and kind of heralded future postseason games. And Penn State, there was kind of as with a lot of bowl games, there was a good guys, bad guys vibe to this one. And Miami eagerly embraced that by showing up in fatigues and so on and so forth. And the game itself was the game in which Penn State forced 7 turnovers, 5 interceptions of Vinny Testaverde, who won the Heisman Trophy that year. And Miami also had 6 drops, 9 penalties, and missed a short field goal, and that really led to their undoing. And Miami actually scored first in the game. Melvin Broughton ran for a touchdown in the second quarter. And then Penn State, which was outgained 445-162, had their only sustained drive of the entire game. They went 74 yards in 12 plays, the biggest being John Schaefer, who was 5 for 16 for 53 yards in the game through the air. He threw a 3rd and 12 pass to Eric Hamilton for 23 yards. And then later on, Schaefer ran 4 yards for a touchdown to tie the game. In the fourth quarter, Miami's Mark Seelig kicked a field goal to make it 10-7. And then Shane Conlon with his second interception of Vinny Testaverde ran 38 yards to the 5, and that set up DJ Dozier's 6-yard touchdown run to put Penn State ahead 14-10 with 8:13 to play. And we all know how the final minutes unfolded, with Miami driving down deep into Penn State territory and facing 4th and goal from the 13. Pete Giftopoulos intercepts Testaverde, and that was all she wrote. So, Mike, what are your memories of that night?
I think Giftopoulos and Shane Conlon both had 2 interceptions, didn't they?
That is correct.
Yeah. Well, the first thing is, and I don't even know if I was thinking this at the time, but Miami was the better team. And they probably should have won the game. And they really screwed this up. I mean, they outgained Penn State, as you mentioned, 3-1. First downs 22-8. I mean, Penn State really didn't do much offensively in the entire game. And Miami's only touchdown came, I think this is correct, Gordie, on a John Schaefer, was set up by a John Schaefer fumble.
Yes, it was. It was a really odd play because
the only way they got a touchdown.
Yeah, Schaefer had this elongated follow through, and he tried to tuck the ball away, and he ended up dropping it into the stomach of Bill Hawkins, a Miami defensive lineman who was lying on the ground. So it was not John Schaefer's finest hour, but he did make that throw, which was
yeah, right. I mean, he was a tough guy. He was a leader. He was not an elite quarterback from a skill level, as it turned out. I think he got. I was reading something. I've read in the last couple of weeks. I've been reading a little bit about this game, and he was. I didn't remember this, but he was signed as an undrafted free agent by the Dallas Cowboys. He was in their camp. He could kind of see the handwriting that he probably was never going to play. So he had an internship at Merrill Lynch lined up, and he sort of asked to be released by the Cowboys so he could go begin a career on Wall Street, which apparently has been incredibly successful. But as a football player, he was I don't want to say, I almost said as a football player, he was a really good stockbroker, but that's a little harsh. But he was, it's amazing that he was a national championship quarterback. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, well, he had something. He had the whole it factor. He was from Cincinnati. And his claim to fame is that he went 66-1 as a starting quarterback from 7th grade on. And the only loss was the year before in the Orange Bowl against Oklahoma, which had a little backstory to it itself. You know, he threw 4 interceptions in that game. And then there was a lot of talk in the offseason between 85 and 86 about whether he would be the starter or his backup, Matt Kisner. And the Harrisburg Patriot infamously had a poll about that, a fan poll, which Kisner came out on top. And but it did not turn out that way. Schaefer was the starter in 86. And
Joe was delighted. Joe was delighted by the fan poll.
Oh, no doubt.
He thought that was just a capital idea. Yeah.
I think Ronnie Chris drew the short straw and had to call Joe and tell him what they were doing.
It wasn't the first time that Ronnie had to deliver unpleasant news to Joe.
Yes.
In fact, Ronnie was, let's a little digression here. Ronnie was really kind of started a lot of this recruiting stuff because he somehow acquired the names of their recruiting class.
Oh, I remember that. Yeah.
At a time when those things weren't even published. I mean, incredible as that seems now. And I think Joe said to him, you know, if you publish that, I'm never going to talk to you again. And Ronnie said, well, tough, I'm publishing it. And Joe kind of backed down. And I don't know if that was a catalyst for a lot of this recruiting journalism that has happened since. But anyway, Ronnie and Joe, a long marriage here.
Yeah, it was that. And really, maybe that's a commentary on who needs who the more.
Yeah, that's a good call. Yeah, really. I think we should talk a little bit about, and you touched on it at the beginning there, but how significant this was in the history of college football as sort of a television event. And it got them away from the New Year's Day model. This was the first time that happened, because the Fiesta Bowl was really determined to sort of join the club of the elite bowls, which were Rose, Orange, Cotton, Sugar at the time. Fiesta wanted to join that club, really couldn't. And those bowls all had conference ties. And so this really interesting situation evolved in the 1986 regular season, where the number 1 and number 2 teams in the country were both undefeated, were independents. Were not in the conference. Miami and Penn State were both independents. So the powers that be at the Fiesta Bowl came up with this idea, and Miami had something of a history during the surge of their program of playing in the Orange Bowl, which was a home game for them. But that year, Nebraska was going to play Oklahoma at the end of the year. The winner wins the Big 8 and goes to the Orange Bowl. Or was it the Big 12 then? I think it was still the Big 8, whatever. And Miami was okay with that if they would have played Nebraska. They were not so okay with it if they would have had a rematch with Oklahoma, who they had already kicked their ass in the regular season. So that sort of set it up where Jimmy Johnson and the powers that be in Miami were amenable. But we were talking about this like in the last week of the regular season. This was still entirely up in the air. I think Penn State was going to the Fiesta Bowl no matter what. But I'm not sure about Miami. And Penn State still had to play Pitt on the last day of the regular season on their end. So they didn't know that it was going to be this matchup. And they had never gone past New Year's Day before. And they had never sort of had this sort of very, very clear-cut, this is the national championship game. And it turned out on a Friday night, NBC turned off its primetime TV lineup to have this game on a Friday night, and it got monster ratings. And, the rest is history, I guess.
Yeah, they paid each team the princely sum of $4.8 million.
Yeah.
Seems very quaint.
It seems quaint now, but pretty big then. More than anybody, slightly more, I think, than anybody else was paying at the time. And then Sunkist was involved. They had a corporate sponsor, which was they were willing and able to sort of create a match and sort of fund that kind of deal. But let's talk about the fact that you were there, big guy. Let's talk a little bit about that and covering the game and covering this sort of good guy versus bad guy element that was played up to by a lot of parties during the week.
Yeah, well, Miami eagerly embraced that, and they arrived at the airport and got off the plane in combat fatigues, which was a nice touch. And then,
correct me if I'm wrong. As I remember it, Jimmy Johnson was already there. He didn't travel with them.
That might be correct. I think it was like their media obligations.
He might have vetoed the Army fatigues or toned them down a little bit if he had actually been on the plane with them. But supposedly, in my memory, he was not there.
So anyway, so then they have this steak fry, and I remember this fairly vividly because it was in this area. Who knows where it was in Phoenix, but I do know we rode a bus out there, and it was this nice thing, and and then both teams got up, and Penn State got up first, and they started doing a rap song, and then John Bruno, who was their punter and actually ended up being a key figure in the game, he's the late John Bruno actually. So he made some reference to Jimmy Johnson's hair, and then he said something which in these times would really not fly even a little bit, but he said, in the interest of team unity, we decided that once a week we'd allow the black guys to eat with us at training table. So that would certainly not fly in this day and age, nor should it. And then Miami got up and they started doing a rap, and then Jerome Brown, who was
Jerome Brown was at the center of this,
the late Jerome Brown then get up and made the Blutarski-esque statement. Did the Japanese go and have dinner with Pearl Harbor before they bombed them? and then he said, and then the entire team walked out. And it was orchestrated, but they tried to make it sound like they were all upset with what Bruno said and whatever. So they walked out. And so
they were going to walk out. They were planning to walk out going into the thing.
Yes, they were. And so 10 years later, I talked to Shane Conlon about it. And first of all, you should understand that Penn State team had a little bit of a badass streak in it, especially their defense. They were called that year for 19 personal fouls or unsportsmanlike conduct penalties. And there was a quote from Joe that year where he said that he's always tried to put the fear of God in his teams, but that team was having none of it. So when I talked to Conlon 10 years after the fact, his reaction to Miami walking out was, it's like, big deal. It didn't bother him. It was funny, actually. And then he went on to say that he felt bad for the bowl people because, they put on a nice welcome for everybody. And that he felt bad for them. He said that he used the word disrespectful. So at any rate, Penn State kind of welcomed Miami's antics, their defense especially. They were fine with that. They wanted that kind of game. They wanted a brawl, and that's exactly what it was.
I watched this game on my computer a couple weeks ago. I watched the whole thing, and it was a really physical game. It was these dudes were smacking each other, and Penn State really did have a big time defense. I didn't think. I remember thinking this back in the day, and I remember watching it again. It didn't feel like Miami was just wiping up the field with them and tearing them up and just couldn't get in the end zone. I mean, it did seem like they had the better of the play on a snap-for-snap basis, but it didn't seem as ridiculously lopsided as those statistics that we talked about at the beginning would suggest. And Shane Conlon was really a good player and ended up being a good pro and could not have played a better game almost. I mean,
he was ridiculously good. He had 2 interceptions in the game. I mean, we mentioned the big one earlier where he intercepted and ran it down to Miami's 5. And there's a quote where he was talking to the Center Daily Times about that play, and he said, "I love watching how I used to be able to run," which is, if that's not a commentary about what football does to you, nothing is. But he was he was a really good college. He was a good pro, but he was a tremendous college player. The year before, when they played Oklahoma, they had this defense that they devised, which was called the bubble, where basically Conlon was supposed to shadow Jamel Holloway. And he did a great job. Holloway didn't hurt them as a runner. You remember Oklahoma at that time was a wishbone team.
Yeah.
And Holloway excelled. Holloway didn't hurt them as a runner. It turned out Penn State's offense was terrible, and Holloway had to hit a big pass at the end to Keith Jackson for a touchdown that clinched the game. But Conlon played really well in that game, and he played just as well in this one. I remember seeing him the morning after this game. He had gotten accidentally leg whipped by Duffy Cobbs, his teammate, while he was chasing a Miami running play. And he jacked up his ankle or his knee or both. And the next morning, he was just limping around. And, he basically played a good portion of that game on one leg. He was exceptional.
Yeah, he was a tough dude. Tough dude.
And I wanted to get back to just the whole badass nature of Penn State's defense. So as I mentioned, I did this story 10 years later, and I talked to Ray Isom, and he just talked about the atmosphere in their huddle, like how it always came down to when, they had 7 games decided by a touchdown or less in 85, and 4 of those in 86, but they always seemed to find a way to pull out the victory. And he just talked about how Donnie Graham, who was their one outside linebacker, also an exceptional player, he's always yelling about who's going to make a play. And Bobby White, who was really religious, he's the defensive end. And he's saying, okay, guys, let's all stick together. God's on our side. And then Isom go, and Tim Johnson, who's the other defensive end, he as Isom described it, he's just the opposite of Bob White. He would be standing right beside Bobby, and he'd be like, let's bleep these guys up. Bobby and Timmy would get into it. Bobby saying, Timmy, we don't need all that.
Oh man, I love that.
I do too. Well, Isom was a pretty badass guy himself, as we know. He's the Harrisburg.
Yeah, he was a good player. Yeah.
Yeah, and before the game, apparently Michael Irvin came jogging up to him, and Irvin, of course, is 6'3", and Isom is probably 5'9", 5'10". And he looked at him and he goes, "Are you Isom?" And he goes, "Yeah." And he goes, "I'm gonna have fun today." And so Isom goes to him, "Keep thinking that."
Yeah. Exactly. You got you right where you want. You keep that mindset. That's just what we're looking for.
Early in the game, Brian Blades was one of Miami's receivers, and Isom jacked him up on a play right in front of the Miami bench. And Benny Blades, who is Brian's brother, is ready to come and fight him. And Isom is standing there, "Hey, bring it on!" It was that kind of night. It was really physical, and I don't know. I've been watching a few games on television, replays of games from that era, and it's striking. It seems so physical, but the players just look different. Their shoulder pads look humongous, for one thing. Yeah. They look twice as big, and then they all have those neck collars, those little like platform things on the back of that stick out of their top of their jerseys. It looked and felt a lot different. I'd kind of forgotten about that, and then watching that game and some of these other ones of this era, it was really physical. Now, here's the other side of that, though. I believe that some people have said Miami was just so good, they should have just ran the ball at them, and they kind of outsmarted themselves a little bit. I don't know if I buy that, but it's something that people have said. Jimmy Johnson kind of outsmarted himself a little bit in this game. Alonzo Highsmith, he ran for 119 yards on 18 carries, and he actually, as a footnote, he later became a prize fighter. Now he's an NFL assistant coach. But be that as it may, at the end of the game, Miami got to the Penn State 6. And that was on third down, and then Tim Johnson had a sack of Testaverde. But when they got to the 6, Highsmith wanted the ball, and a lot of his teammates wanted him to have the ball. Yeah. And who knows what went into that decision-making process. But ultimately, Testaverde tried to throw the pass into the left side of the end zone, and Diftopoulos intercepted. And if he hadn't intercepted, I counted 3 other Penn State defenders between Testaverde and Perryman. Yeah. Donnie Graham was there, Eddie Johnson was there, Ray Isom was there. There's no way that pass is getting through.
Yeah, there was nothing there, which leads me to the next sort of thing that people say or believe about this game, which is that they had figured something out about Penn State had figured something out about Testaverde or about their passing game, and an infamous name comes up here.
I was just going to mention
Sandusky supposedly had a very significant role in devising this sort of genius game plan. So what do you say?
Well, yeah. In fact, the story that I wrote, the 10-year anniversary story, we talked about that. And what they honed in on was the Testaverde would make the read based on the pre-snap look. So Penn State came out and they would show him one thing before the snap and then give him something else.
Right.
And the other thing was he locked on to guys. That seemed pretty apparent too.
Yeah.
Even as an NFL player, I think he had that tendency. So yeah, there was something to that. And in fact, the quote that Jerry gave me for this story, he said, "I don't think I've ever been in a game that went off as planned as well as that one." And
that's interesting.
That's certainly true.
Yeah.
And let's also talk about the fact that John Bruno, 9 punts for 43.4, and he killed, I think, 3 inside the 11. He was a big part of this game.
You would never have thought that this was going to be one of those, field position battles, but it kind of was. And in that context, the punter was huge. You're right. The punter.
I mean, they did exactly what they had to do. They made him go the long way, except for that one drive in the first quarter where Schaefer had the turnover. And, figuring that Miami wasn't going to be able to complete a drive, and that pretty much was how it unfolded.
Now, all of these, I've seen, 30 for 30 type things about this game and about this Miami sort of dynasty that they had. And a lot of these guys have said, and Jimmy Johnson has said, this is the most disappointing loss of my football career at any level. Do you think it was Joe's best win? I kind of think it was.
It's got to be up there. It's got to be up there.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that because I talked to Alonzo Highsmith for this story too, and he mentioned how one time he talked to Joe Namath about a game that always stuck in his craw, and I guess there was some loss that Namath had to Texas or something, and Highsmith compared that game to this one in his case about how he just couldn't get over it, which I could totally understand because Highsmith was exceptional in that game. They really couldn't tackle him.
Miami won the national championship the year before and the year after, didn't they?
I believe that's correct.
Yeah. So, you really.
No, they didn't win it in 85. Oklahoma won it in 85. Because Miami lost to Tennessee in the Orange 35-7.
Okay. All right. So they were coming up at this point.
Yeah.
They were kind of coming up more than, because, and then they had a pretty good run for a long while even after Jimmy Johnson left. Well, I think their best team was that 01?
Oh yeah, I was just going to mention that. That had
unbelievable team.
Oh yeah, Ed Reed was on that team. Everybody was on that team.
Yeah, and that was Larry Coker was the coach of that team.
Yeah,
and they played Penn State in the season opener and killed them. That was right when I was starting to cover the team. That was right at the beginning of my run covering Penn State, and they really hammered. They really hammered Penn State. So they had a nice long run. But Penn State won 2 national titles in 5 years?
5 years, yeah. 82 and 86. That is correct. I wanted to. This is a little bit of a sidelight, but you touched on Shane Conlon earlier. It's interesting to me because Penn State has this reputation as linebacker U, and I think the names that come immediately to mind are Jack Ham, understandably, because he was tremendous. He's in the college and Pro Football Hall of Fames. LeVar Arrington, understandably, also gets mentioned right away because of his spectacular athleticism. But Conlon is usually not mentioned prominently, and I think that's a small injustice anyway. I think he was exceptional.
I would agree with that. They had a lot of guys. I think people. I'm almost getting just. This is sort of like the grave mistake of taking social media as a barometer of anything. But you sort of. People want to talk about linebacker U, but it almost feels like they think that begins with Arrington.
Yeah,
and it doesn't. It really doesn't. Ham was just an unbelievable player, and Conlon was tremendous, and they had a lot. Remember Lance Mell?
I do.
Very good player who turned out to be a good pro. I think he was a Pro Bowl type guy, and they've had a lot of them. I mean, you think about Puzzlesny and Sean Lee and Navarro Bowman.
Yeah.
mean, because he sort of burned out a little bit prematurely with injuries once he got to the NFL. People have maybe forgotten him a little bit, but and we now there's now a guy there, Micah Parsons, who certainly looks like he's going to take his place in that group.
Yeah, I think that's a fair estimation. Was Navarro Bowman better before he capitalized the V or after?
It's an excellent question.
These are the burning questions we answer on After the Buzzer.
Yeah, how did he spell? How did Navorro? But
that is correct.
For a while, the V was capitalized, and for a while, it was not.
Yeah, I believe when he was in college, it was not capitalized. Apparently, that was too flashy for Penn State, so they didn't.
Oh, Penn State was involved in it. Okay, well, that's a little bit too. The cultivating the image hasn't changed, but the precise nature of the image has changed a little bit.
Just a tad. But at any rate, there were a couple things I remember about that whole run up to the week. Just how it was. They didn't bring Trey Bauer around for the breakdown press conferences till Friday or Thursday or whatever the last day possible was. And I remember Bud Tallman standing there and as Bauer sitting at this little table, let's get Bauer out of here. He's a ticking time bomb.
In what sense was he a ticking time bomb?
Because he would speak the truth.
He was okay. He's one of those guys. We can't have that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I talked to Bauer for this story too, and he was actually the defensive play caller. And his quote about himself, like running the huddle, was, "I was the one who had to try to keep all those guys in line, much less myself, which is hard enough."
Yeah, self-lining is hard. Yeah, that's right. So it's interesting. That was it was a really good physical Penn State team, and they went 12-0. You could talk about this being an upset, and you could say, well, if those teams played 10 times, Miami would have won 7 or 8 of them, but Penn State still went 12-0, and right after this, so many things changed. A couple years later, Penn State joins the Big Ten, and Miami eventually joined, I guess the Big East and then the ACC, right?
I think that's the way that it went. Correct.
And then came the BCS, and now we got a playoff. But this was really an historic game from a television standpoint, and from a sort of making this heavyweight title matchup thing outside of the normal structure of the bowl games and the bowl/poll system, which had always determined the national championship.
Yeah, I remember after Penn State beat Georgia for their first national championship, some writer asked Joe, well, you've always been an advocate of a playoff system. How do you feel about that now? And Joe said, this year, let's vote.
God love him. Which is exactly the right answer. Why did it? If it hurt us in the past, why shouldn't it help us in this case, right?
Yeah, I suppose that's correct. Yeah. But at any rate, a real interesting development. This game was really a breakthrough kind of thing in a lot of different perspectives, I guess, just as far as the whole thing went. I wanted to go back to the one pass that Schaefer hit. Remember, he threw for 53 yards in the game, and they won. Yeah. But 23 of them came on a single play. And so when I talked to Fran Ganner like that about that, let me find the quote. It was actually kind of funny because he was kind of saying, he said, I can picture that because when we called it, you sit there and you say, oh, what did we do? So he wasn't exactly brimming with confidence about what was going to transpire there either. Because, Eric Hamilton was just kind of one of the guys that Penn State usually had plenty of wide receiver.
The Isaac Smolko syndrome, man.
Yeah, so.
Ganner was, I got a kick out of Ganner. When the rare times when he would, I remember him one time saying, we would come into these coaches meetings and suggest something to Joe and over and over and over, and Joe would say, "Nah, we're not gonna do that. We're not gonna do that. We're not gonna do that." And then one day he would come in and say, "Hey guys, I got an idea," and it would, it would be the thing that they had been trying to get him to do forever. I like Ganner a lot. I thought he was good.
Yeah, he was an interesting cat in a lot of ways.
Have we covered it, big guy? I think we've covered it.
I think we've reached the conclusion of this week's walk down memory lane. We'll continue again next week, and until then, I'm Gordie. That's Mike, and we'll talk to you then.
Peace out.
There we have it.